Hello and welcome everyone. I'm HatTopGaming and we are back with another backlog review. Today's episode is all about the Galactic Empire, the Jedi running from it, and a holocron they're all after. A Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order made it all the way back in 2019. After the not so great initial receptions of the Battlefront game, EA finally did what fans wanted and made a single player action game in the Star Wars universe once again. This time made by Respawn, the studio behind Titanfall. It was a big hit when it came out and really reinvigorated people's want for more Star Wars games. It was also surprising for taking a different approach to Star Wars games as a whole that previously had never been done. We'll be going over all the things that made this game good and bad and deciding whether or not this game still holds up today. We'll be doing this by doing a overview of the story, gameplay, and performance. If you like today's video, make sure to like, subscribe, and make sure to stick around to the end of the video for a sneak peek of my next review. But with all that out of the way, let's begin. Starting off with the story, we are Cal Kestis, a former Padawan who narrowly escaped the Jedi Purge thanks to their master, and now living in hiding on the planet in which the Purge occurred for them. We fast forward about 10 years where our story begins with Cal. As he's just doing what he can to survive after an accident happens where he works, he is forced to use the Force in order to save his friend. And of course, some snitch saw it and reports it to the authorities, so the Empire shows up, which leads to Cal getting exposed, forcing him to go on the run. He ends up meeting with his future partners in Sierra and Grease. Through a series of events, the team has led to some old holotapes of a Jedi Master who had hidden away a holocron, which had the names of Force-sensitive children. So Cal and his team set out to find it. I thought the story had pretty good pacing and takes you a few interesting places, but I wasn't a fan of how during the duration of the story, we get flashbacks to Cal's training before the Purge, which is how we get certain Force abilities such as Force Push, Pull, and Double Jump. The explanation is his connection to the Force was damaged, which I guess led to him losing some connection to the Force and therefore lost some of those powers. But I wasn't a fan of that, as the only thing it really did was create a reason to backtrack to other planets you had visited to find collectibles you previously couldn't get to. Plus, Cal can fight perfectly fine and deflect blaster shots with ease from the beginning, despite the fact that the purge happened when he was like 10, so how does that make sense? I just found it a bit of a cheap way to try and extend player time, but whatever. Moving on over to gameplay now, which is the most surprising part of the game. It's a mix of Tomb Raider and Dark Souls. We're going to break down the exploration and combat, so let's start off with the main thing you'll be doing, which is exploring the planets. The exploration seems to be built around the same ideas that the reboot Tomb Raider games were built around as well. Some basic parkour, some map puzzle solving, having to interact with the world to manipulate it so you can get to higher up areas. You know, the basic push a box into place so you can use it to get higher kind of thing. But the boxes are spinning balls this time. Swinging on vines and cables to get past big gaps, and wall running. Most of the levels spent doing these things and finding some old Republic boxes that carry skins, clothes for Cal, his lightsaber, and the ship. Besides that, you can also find some secrets that really aren't that secret. They just increase max health or max force level, which essentially acts as a mana bar for force powers and attacks. You can also find some echoes scattered around the map that act as old memories, giving some little tidbits on what had happened in that area previously. They really don't amount to much of anything though, like they're their equivalent of a Riddler trophy. With exploration being the main thing you do, in an effort to keep you engaged, they do a lot of wall running, jumping, and other movement based actions. The biggest issue with exploration though is the fact that there's no fast travel system of any kind, so once you complete your objective on any given planet, you gotta run all the way back now. And if you decide to return to any past planets to recover additional collectibles you couldn't get the first time, you have to traverse the entire map to do so. And doing so on some of these bigger maps is gonna take a good minute, even with the shortcuts you unlock. All this just seems like a cheap way to try to increase player time and without actually giving the player anything actually something of note to do. Moving on over to combat now, I have to imagine when the first trailer of this game dropped, most people were expecting another Force Only style game, but in reality, it plays a lot more like Sekiro. The game's combat system is built around a dodge and parry mechanic with a heavy emphasis on parrying, as enemies have stamina slash block bars you need to break in order to be able to get any more hits. Otherwise, you're dodging and waiting until there's a window where you can hit them. In Dark Souls, you have no way to heal besides the Estus flasks, and in Fallen Order, you have the same thing, but there's stim packs that your droid tosses you because there's no health regen. And there's also bonfires, aka meditation spots, but unlike in Dark Souls, these are actually pretty plentiful throughout all the planets. It took some time to get used to combat, as enemies have these delayed attacks where they take these long winds up before they actually swing, but once you get the feel for it, it gets much easier. There isn't a whole lot of combat at the start of the game, and most of the time, or at least 50% of the time, you're fighting creatures rather than actual human enemies who either have blasters or some sort of melee weapon. Now personally, I was not really a fan of how many creatures you had to fight compared to the actual forces of the Empire, as the creatures you fight had these either really obnoxious hitboxes or these movesets that just end up dragging out fights, making certain planets a chore to deal with. You do have a relatively normal skill tree that unlocks new attacks and increases things like health, damage, and force abilities. Later on in the game, you also do get the ability to swap between dual blade and single bladed lightsaber combat, but I found that using dual bladed weapons, your damage is decreased, with the trade off, of course, being that you can hit more enemies at once. So, it does have its uses for crowd control, because if there's one thing these types of games love to do, it's throw more enemies at you than you can realistically handle. And in the later parts of the game, they're really annoying about that. There's a handful of boss battles here and some sub bosses. Focusing on the story mainline bosses, there's really only three, not counting the giant bird. There's technically five boss fights, but three of them are against the same person, so I'm not going to really count that. I really didn't struggle with any of them besides the final boss, and it's due to the fact they have a completely different moveset from anything else you face in the game, with multi-step combos, multiple unblockable attacks, and just overall just more different abilities in other boss fights and other fights. So of course it threw me for a loop, but even still the game is very much beatable. Combat wise, this isn't really what I wanted if I'm being honest, and I kept telling myself that while playing the first few hours and dying constantly, but I persevered, and if you do too, you will eventually get the hang of it like I did. Moving on to the performance now, I originally started playing the game on the Steam Deck. While yes, it's very much playable, the game is incredibly buggy and poorly optimized, and it's not the Steam Deck's fault either. This game on release was janky as all hell, and so was the sequel, by the way. And all these years later, it still cannot hold a stable frame rate. I played about 4 hours on the Steam Deck before switching over permanently to the Xbox Rogue Ally X, and man, while I could run the game at higher graphics and higher frames per second, I still couldn't avoid dealing with haziness, stuttering when attacking enemies, lag spikes, falling into the abyss because certain moves wouldn't register during parkour segments, frame drops, and more. From a graphics perspective, the game still looks great, and I'm glad the Steam Deck users can in fact play the game. But the one bug I encountered the most was when I would try to strike certain enemies for the first time, the game would just freeze frame, so I had to start taking that into account by rolling away rather than attempting to do follow-up strikes, since I had no idea what the next frames were going to show. Now, while it never let me dying, and I would usually never take hits from it, the fact I had to take that into account as often as I did was just simply not acceptable. I understand that people's tolerance for buggy games ranges heavily, and as someone who has been blessed enough to mostly not have to play buggy games, or at least I've been able to avoid bugs in my playthroughs, it's all the more frustrating when it's something that's almost baked into the experience. Again, I do want to reiterate that the game does look good, and on the Ally X, I would get upwards of 50 frames per second. But for whatever reason, Dathomir seemed to have the most issues frame rate wise, but Kashyyyk had the most amount of stuttering. Is it playable? Yes, of course, but you just gotta be ready to deal with all the minor bugs that are going to be occurring during every single play session. I could not avoid them, unfortunately. Now, before we wrap up the video and I give my final thoughts on the game, I want to talk about something that caught my attention and really started to annoy me the longer I went on. I'm going to go over some spoilers, but I'm going to try not to spoil too much, so if you want to avoid all that, just skip to this timestamp here. I'll give you guys a few seconds to do that, just in case. Alright, you guys ready? You see, this game suffers from what I would call first game in a franchise itis. So, just to give you some key examples before I explain what I mean, think of Spider-Man 2018, God of War 2018, The Callisto Protocol, Days Gone, Shadow of Mordor, The Outer Worlds, Rage, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Guardians of the Galaxy, and many others. Games that either started a new franchise or were meant to continue an existing one in a new context. So what does Jedi Fallen Order share with some of these games? Well, we can start off with the worst aspect of the game being the enemy variety. You spend over half the game fighting some variation of space bugs and mammals that, you're a Jedi with a lightsaber. Does that sound fun for you? Because I promise you it isn't. God of War had the same issue with the troll monsters for every sub boss, but you would have different elemental abilities, I guess, with them. Shadow of Mordor compared to Shadow of War didn't have nearly as much of a complex system and didn't have nearly much variety among the Uruks. The first game in a franchise either has the lamest enemies, low variations, or a new system that is created and then just half baked along the way, especially compared to its follow ups. How about the useless story that ultimately ends up being pointless? The entire story of Jedi Fallen Order is ultimately for nothing, as the ending basically boils down to the real treasure was the friends we made along the way. I'm not even joking. It was such a slap in the face to watch that final cutscene, and Kingdom Come Deliverance does the same thing too, where Henry's quest isn't even fulfilled. You really only even go so far in it, and you have to accomplish the rest in the sequel. Rage ends out of nowhere because of a cliffhanger that just never gets resolved. Even in the sequel, they just completely ignore that and just pick things up like 20 years later. They just don't acknowledge it. Its exit sequel was only half the length it was originally supposed to be, which is why its sequel was terrible and just really felt flat. Jedi Fallen Order does the same thing with the 5-year time jump in the sequel because of how it ends. Like, there's just no way to pick up the story from where they left it off. Days Gone and Callisto have the other version of this issue, where the entire game's story is written around the idea of a sequel that never comes to be. So you have a bunch of extra lore and info about the world that amounts to nothing. Also, a major plot point in the game is Deborah Wilson's character cutting herself off from the Force after breaking out of an Imperial jail. But how the fuck do you cut yourself off from the Force only to then just start using it again? That's not how that works. At least Cal had the excuse of his connection to the Force was damaged due to trauma. Like, yeah, sure, she could say the same thing, but she actively says how she just chose to cut herself off from the Force. You mean you just stop using it? You can't just cut yourself off and then just start using it again. That's not how that works. Also, I want to mention the whole Vader showing up at the end thing. While it's cool, it's starting to get played out because he's constantly showing up in stuff now, like in the mall show, ever since like Rogue One, and he never really does much. Like, yeah, he poses a threat and he's never beatable, but aside from killing no-name characters on occasion, he never really does anything. We already talked about the poor optimization, so we don't need to repeat it. The last major issue these first games tend to have is either with bloat or badly or wasted time developing things in order to extend the game's runtime. Remember how I mentioned there's no fast travel in Fallen Order? Because of that, how the planets are designed, the map creators had to waste time creating an independent route back to the start of the map. God of War made an overly convoluted way to fast travel using the realm tunnel rather than just being able to travel from dock to dock via your boat. The devs could have created a whole other planet if they had not just wasted time doing what they had. There's 5 planets in this game: Dathomir, Kashyyyk, which has been done a million times already before, mind you, the ice planet where the lightsaber crystals are formed, Zepho, which is used twice, and Bogano, which is spent like 20 minutes on at the start of the game, and then you don't even come back until the end for like another 20 minutes. Even if you disagree with my point about the bloat and wasted time argument, cool. The other side stuff I could argue is the fact that there's just so little to actually do or explore, which means replayability really doesn't exist. If it's not an issue of bloat in the first game of the franchise, it's always the hardest to replay because there's so little to actually do, and a little reason to come back furthermore trying to explore because all they're trying to do is make a game good enough to enjoy so they can set up a better sequel. It's super easy to lead people on, all they need is the promise or even just the thought of something else better if they buy and play it. I really want you to go and rewatch the reveal trailer for Jedi Fallen Order, and then go watch the reveal trailer for Jedi Survivor. You can immediately tell and see the difference in not only how they distinguish themselves, but how much more effort is put into each one. Not to say this game is bad or the developers didn't try, but they were definitely pulling some punches and then some. So in the end, how did I feel about Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order? Well, I think this game really is a tale of two halves. On one end, Star Wars fans like such as myself finally got another action adventure game that not only proved to be fun, but showed EA and other gaming companies that Star Wars games, especially single player experiences, are still in fact in demand. But on the other end, I think it's a game created to test just how much they can mix up the formula in order to create new experiences, which is good and bad, of course, when it comes to experimenting. But also waste time trying to flush out its world with very tedious and uninspired additions that, simply put, were boring and unnecessary. It took me 16 hours flat to reach the credits, and I got 19 to 39 achievements along the way. I was playing on Jedi Master difficulty, and while I think the story is fine for what it is, it sometimes felt hard to engage with as way too much attention is taken off of Cal and put on Sierra, Deborah Wilson's character, who was painted as this sympathetic character with a tragic backstory that just didn't land for me at all. From the way her story is explained to the tropes they use to explain it, none of it is original and none of it really matters in the grand scheme of things, and it just takes time off of Cal's journey because it's not hers, so I don't really care about her background. Combat, while not what I wanted, once I settled into it, I was having fun with it. My biggest issue just stems from the fighting a million bugs rather than stormtroopers, and that's why you want to play as a Jedi, to fight human-esque enemies, not creatures from random planets. And while the boss fights were decent, there was very little variety, and having to fight the same Inquisitor 3 times was just overall lame. Again, performance was a big part of the equation. While playing, it didn't bother me too much. That ending though, jeez, that felt like such a slap in the face, and I was so pissed watching that final cutscene. It was so bad, it immediately dropped the game a full point down for me in my mind. Look, I think this game has an interesting premise, and the sequel looks promising. The game has some decent highs, but its floor is a little low. This is one of those games where I know I'm not going to come back to it because there's just no real replay value for me here. But for a one-time playthrough, it's a fun game, and I enjoyed it for what it was. But when you do backlog reviews like I do, you really have to balance how you judge these games. Some of the judgment has to come from how well or bad the game has aged. Can't judge it as if we were still in 2019. But I also have to recognize what the game meant at the time and impact if it did have any at all. Everything that this game does well comes with an asterisk. The combat was cool, but what you fight half the time isn't. The game has a cool premise as a Padawan who survived the Purge, but the quest you go on is ultimately undermined by the ending. The game looks great, but even still just on medium settings, but has noticeable performance issues across the board. With the game being smaller scale, it does its best to flesh out characters and even have some cameos, but its characters are uninteresting in my opinion, and the cameos aren't anything too exciting, besides the obvious one, if you know what it is. I'm going to give the game a 6.5 out of 10. I think there was a strong foundation laid out here, but it fails to capitalize on most of it, and I really feel there was a lot left on the chopping block. It honestly feels like Respawn had a vision, and somewhere along the line, it was altered, and it just left a lot to be desired, in my opinion. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Hope you all enjoyed today's backlog review on Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. If you like what you saw here today, consider hitting the like button and subscribe for more backlog reviews like this. I also do make videos on newer games that come out when I can. If you haven't played Fallen Order yet, let me know if my video encouraged or discouraged you from playing it. If you have any thoughts, comments, or questions you want to ask me, of course, feel free to put it down in the comment section down below. Thanks again for watching. I'm HatTopGaming. Don't forget to share this video with all your friends, and I'll see you all later. Peace.